Hopefully you guys can see this. All right, well, good morning, members of the board. Here we are at the end of the year. This has been a really exciting year. Before I get into this, I wanted to relay a couple of things I think, some things that I've experienced that I think kind of apply to some of the stuff that we're doing here. Obviously, here we are, the end of 2017. It feels like we started this process just a couple of months ago because it's been very compressed, a lot of work. Yesterday, I was coming out of a meeting, and I went out for lunch, and on my way to a different location to get some more things done, stopped by a burger joint to grab a burger, and something kind of happened that had me thinking overnight that I thought was kind of funny. The teenager that was operating the cash register charged me, and then he turned around and he gave me a senior discount. And I thought, wow, you think about assumptions, right? People making assumptions and whatnot. And I thought to myself, do I really want to stand here and argue with this kid, try to convince him to take my money that I'm not really that old, right? I couldn't get myself to do that because some of these battles are just not worth. So I said, okay, I'll save my 37 cents and go on, right? So I started thinking about that because in the context of this system deployment, we've had all these outreach efforts that we've been doing throughout the year, and it's been challenging, I know, because it was slow at first, and I felt like we were on the same boat trying to convince the kid that we're not really that old, right? And in terms of momentum and keeping things moving, sometimes it's easier just to shrink back and say, I'm not gonna have this argument. And we recently had this outreach effort again. It was actually done here, and I was really pleased and excited to see that the room was full and that there was a lot of attention being paid to the things that we were communicating to the group that was here. And I feel like we're starting to turn the corner on this overall process because now it's real and people are starting to recognize that it's real. And for the longest time, when we got started in this process, nobody would believe that we could build this as fast as we were saying that we were going to build it. And it seemed like no matter where we went, even if they shook their heads and they listened to you, in the back of their minds, they're looking at me like, yeah, you're still that old guy, take the discount, right? So I just wanted to express that I'm really excited. I'm really proud of the outreach committee because they've done a really good job at doing this. And I think as things start to come up, it's going to get more involved and more complicated, but it'll be good because people will see the real thing that's happening. We won't have to convince them because it'll be there, right, for them to see. So I had to call my wife home and let her know. Somebody thought I was old and she kind of laughed at me. So, all right. So as we look at the project, we've seen this map before. This is the current view of where we stand, right? The solid greens, meaning that we've completed the sites. The greens with motion means that we're actively building. The squares with the T's means that towers have been ordered. So there's been some movement on this, and I want to explain some of that. But before I forget, one of the things I want to mention to Swick Meyer, he was talking about the radio list. And one thing that I thought it's important to mention is that your Iowa has sort of jumped over in terms of technology, and it's been a really big jump. And you're kind of at the cutting edge right now, and you will be. And so you're going to be part of a exclusive club, if you will, of folks that have done this at a large scale, like we're doing it here in the state of Iowa. So that's good, and that presents challenges because you look at the issues with the outdated lists. Well, that presents a challenge. It's not unsurmountable, but it's something that could be handled. It just means that we got to reach out to those entities that have done these large-scale integrations and see how they've handled some of these things. There's people out there. We've supported many of them. We have the resources and the experience in dealing with other projects, so I would encourage the board to reach out to anybody from Motorola. We got a whole bunch of folks here in the back. Because some of those insights, it kind of goes back to why reinvent the wheel, right? Some of these things have happened. Some of these things have been considered before, and so accessing our collective insight really can make a difference and save you guys a lot of time. So, all right. As we look at this map, so what's changed? I'm pretty sure you guys have looked at this, you wouldn't be able to tell. So I highlighted them. So all of these circles indicate the sites that we've changed status, all right? So status in many ways, so I figured I wanted to actually even highlight this and show you the different categories. So since last time, right now, these are the sites that have been completed since we spoke at our last board meeting. So we have 7 sites that have completed. We've done the civil work on them. Scattered throughout the state. We have 3 sites in which we've ordered towers. And what does that mean? That means that those sites were stuck in the regulatory process, which we couldn't order towers before. Now we can order towers because that means that we passed the regulatory process, we can get the permits and start building. So the first step in that process is we order the steel. We never order the steel until it's final, the I's are dotted, T's are crossed, because we want to make sure that once we order that, there's no going back. All right, we have 2 sites that have changed to active build. That means that we had ordered the towers before because they had finished the regulatory, and we were waiting for resources to be made available from other sites that were completed to come over and do these. So now these has flipped from being in the regulatory to ordering the towers to now actually doing builds. We still have 5 sites that are the regulatory process, which is actually an improvement. And what I've done is I've highlighted what we're looking at, the targeted dates for the regulatory to finish for these sites. So if you look in, for example, in Region 1, we have 2 sites. The latest one, or the last one, is in Warren County. So we're talking about March for that one. And then we go throughout, and you can see that it's anywhere from December of this year, and the worst case being March of next year. So once we complete the regulatories on those, and it passes, then we go to the next stage, which is we order the towers and we start working on the foundations. After that, we have the 3 sites that I call them my problem sites. And these are IPTV sites that we haven't been able to get started on them. And I'm highlighting them here, and I'm showing that we have no start date because we really cannot touch those sites until we're allowed to touch those sites. So one of the sites, this one that I'm highlighting here in the middle, it's in Region 2. That's a site that we could actually start today if we wanted to, because we've done assessments on the structures, and we know that we don't have to modify the structures to get started. So the tower structure can support the additional load. We'd like to get started, but we can't yet. The other 2, we're still working on structural analysis. We know some modifications are needed. We defined those, but again, we can't start until we have the permissions to go ahead and get started. All right, so here's what I want to do is just show a couple of photos here of the work that we're doing. In this case, we have the Lee site, which I'm highlighting in the blinking red circle. So on the Lee site, as we've been building the site, it's actually built already, but here's an example of the foundations that we were working on. The pillars, these pillars are really, really deep in order to support the towers. We have the pads that are in place already at that particular point in time. And then we start building up the tower on top of those foundations. Again, a lot of work, and it's always the same. Everybody's always surprised because We talk about it forever, and then we get it done in 2 weeks. We also have the Jones site as well. Here's an example of the drilling rig that we use to dig for the foundations. And you can see all the rebar that's required to support that. We're talking about foundations that are about 60 feet deep. Here's a broader view so you can appreciate how deep these foundations are. Once we pour them, we put in all the hardware that's needed, and after about a week, there we go. We have a little bit that sticks up on the top. We deliver the towers to the site, and we stack it up in a week. Here's the beginning of that process. For the in Webster, again, we already had the pads delivered or built at that point, so here we're just dropping off the shelter. We had actually already built the tower. You can see the tower here, here on the side. That's a brand new tower with all of our dishes on it. Here's an example of Carroll. Again, this is a completed site, so you can see how clean it looks. This is what the typical new, what we call greenfield site looks like. Got the brand new shelter, the tower, 1,000-gallon LP tank, generators, and the like. I had to stand back a little bit to be able to capture the entire site, but that's what the brand new site looks like. Again, for Clayton, in this case, this is just an example. You can see this is actually the truck that delivers the tower. It comes in pieces. And we have to build it as, put it together in some pieces in chunks and other pieces just get assembled right on the tower itself. So it's complicated. A structure like this, I heard something in the background about wind. This week has been terrible for wind, actually. I went and visited some sites, and I couldn't even get out of my car because the wind was pushing the door. So when we have things like this, we experience delays because obviously we can't elevate that thing up when you have 45-mile-per-hour gusts, shooting that thing around. It gets dangerous. Shelby is interesting because here what I want you to see is, you notice that we ordered the tower in Shelby, but we hadn't actually started building. And the reason we hadn't started building is because Shelby is a unique case in which we have to tear down the tower that's there so we can build a brand new one. And it's very tight space. And also the tower is needed to maintain DOT winter operations. So what we did was we took the one of the trailers and we equipped them. And here's an example of that where we added some special hardware in order to mount this VHF antenna to it. And we went ahead and actually set it up in the site. And DOT has moved on to that, to use that so we can start tearing down the tower that's there. All right. We've also taken one of the SCR trailers and made it a P25 standalone site. And here, these are pictures of what we've installed inside the trailer. We've been able to show it a couple of times, and this is great for events or disasters where a trunk site can really support a large number of talk groups for that particular event or scenario. One of the things that we're doing also is that we're doing 360-degree views, and we're starting that now, and we're going to even do some more later. And the reason we're doing that is because it's still sometimes really hard to gain the perspective of the site if you're not really there. And so what we're doing is we're taking these snapshots, and I'm going to show you what it looks like, so that in the future, if the state wants to make any changes or they want to understand the impact, they can go back and take a look at this library of pictures. So as my example here, here is the story site. So now that we have this capability, you can literally just walk around as if you were there and look around at what the story site looks like, right? There's the LP tank, the generators on the other side, there's a shelter, and there's a tower up there. Again, so we're trying to do this with all the sites because, again, this really gives you a perspective that if you're not there, you can really go back and take a look at this stuff and gain a really clear understanding of what that is. And of course, you can zoom in and out. All right, so in summary, build, build, build. That's all we've been doing. And we've been pushing really, really hard all the way to the end of the year. We got folks out there today. They'll be there next week. They'll be there the week of Christmas because we're really committed to making sure that this happens. So we have, last count, my recent count was we had 15 teams right now operating at the same time throughout the state. So the civil site completion certification process is still ongoing as we keep on going visiting these sites to confirm that they really are done. The microwave dish installations are continuing as we go. Only 5 sites that are in a regulatory process. That probably doesn't sound impressive, but that's a huge victory. The fact that we only have 5 sites that are still going through regulatory process, and those are going to be done actually very near future. And once that's done, as you've seen, we'll be able to start building those sites very quickly, which we intend to. We have all the equipment, we have the shelters, the generators, and the only thing that we have to order is the towers. But while the towers are being built and shipped, we'll be putting in the foundations and we'll be delivering the shelters and everything to the site, getting it ready. So we will not be passive. We will continue being very aggressive about this so we can get this thing done. We still continue with 5 lease sites, and we're going to start building before the end of this year in those lease sites. And the last thing I want to point out here is that we still have these internal state processes that need to be resolved for the IPTV towers. So the IPTV towers are now the critical path. The towers, if we don't resolve that, we're going to have a problem with being able to close out the project. That's all I had. Any questions?
Delvin, we get a lot of calls about when's my tower going to be ready? When can you turn it on? Well, when you do that, it's called site trunking, correct?
Correct.
So can you explain the ups and downs of that? Because we do have one that's hot, I know, in Waterloo.
Yes, yes.
But you got to be careful with that. So if you could explain site trunking versus when it's all connected to another site.
Sure. So site trunking is a fallback mode, if you will. And the whole idea behind site trunking is that if the site was to become isolated, meaning that it can no longer reach the core, we don't want the radio users to find themselves that they can't communicate with each other. So the whole idea about site trunking is that the site itself allows the users to continue to communicate with each other, but since the site is now disconnected from the core, cannot reach dispatch or can't reach folks that are far away. But if these folks are associated with the same site, they can still talk to each other. So what it does is it basically becomes a wide open site that says, we don't want to put any restrictions. If you're here, stay here, and guys can still communicate. So as we're building these up, and as there's requests for putting the sites into site trunking, it's really more of a demonstration of capabilities and get somewhat familiar with how trunking works and whatnot. If the desire is to use it for operations, then there's risk associated with that because, for example, their dispatches won't be able to reach the site itself unless they have consulates that they use to communicate, right? So that's really all site trunking is. It's just a way to make sure that folks are not out there with dead radio. And that's all it is. Once the sites connect to the core, then the core goes back into implementing the proper permissions and verifying identities and all that kind of stuff. So basically, if you have a radio and you're not programmed into the core, the site will look at the radio will identify itself, the site will talk to the core and say, can this guy be on this site? And the core will say, no, reject them. And site trunking, we don't do that because, again, it's more restrictive. We actually want it to be more open because it represents a failed scenario that we want people to be able to use the site in a failed scenario.
I just want to, when I talk about that, when they call and ask, when the site is in site trunking, as like the Waterloo site, let's just use that as an example. I caution to not use that as a true picture of your coverage.
Correct.
Because that's just one island.
Correct.
When other sites will be pushing RF and joining with that, in the Waterloo case, that site's going to be talking to Bramer 7 miles away or 10 air miles away, which would enhance the coverage in the whole area because of the simulcast. So the point I wanted you to drive home was just because it's in site trunking, if you do give you some radios to test and feel what trunking is like, don't rely on that's the true footprint.
Correct.
Because it will significantly increase when the other sites are all together.
Correct.
So that's the risk that you take with letting people try this.
Yes.
With coverage.
And that's sometimes hard to get across because people will listen to you but won't understand it or will forget it. And so if you do provide radios for folks to get acquainted with it, and it's only one site, and perhaps that particular area makes use of 3 sites to provide the coverage, then their experience is going to be less than satisfactory. They're going to say, "Oh, this is not as good as you guys said it was going to be." Right. But if they're all connected to the core, then the core makes sure that all the sites can communicate to each other, and so the operation of the radio system then becomes to the user ubiquitous. Doesn't really matter. One last thing I wanted to mention, actually, it just came to mind now that you said that, is you were talking about roaming. I think you mentioned about roaming. And again, I wanted to encourage you to reach out, particularly Minnesota. I actually worked on expanding the state of Minnesota by adding 3 additional zones to the state. And there were some concerns back then with using different types of radios because even though P25 radios are standardized as the air interface, what's not standardized is the roaming algorithms on the radios. So you can have a radio that will work fine in a site, but doesn't necessarily roam nicely or seamlessly between sites, right? And so, in terms of operations, not everybody understood that, and that's why the state of Minnesota was restrictive at first because they wanted to make sure that people would get that, and these bugs were being worked out with other vendor radios as well. So just a little bit of insight there.